Mother Bear fell into a trap. When she saw who was lying under it, the forester rushed to help. Winter in Yukon is unlike any other. It isn't just cold. It's a thick, breathless stillness, a white veil covering the entire world, making everything feel as if it has stopped breathing. In that silence lies a humble wooden cabin, hidden among snow-laden pine trees, where Charlotte Kidman lives alone. 55 years old, her silver hair peeks out from under a worn woolen hat. Charlotte always lived by herself, believing she doesn't need anyone, and no one can make her feel attached anyway. She thought she's best friends with loneliness. But who would have thought an unexpected encounter with a wild animal may change her point of view forever, may lit up her mind, heart, and soul, that even herself never thought it could be possible. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Charlotte was once a wildlife rescue specialist, having spent decades among injured leopards, deer caught in traps, and baby birds fallen from their nests. But as age crept into her joints and her soul grew weary, she chose to retreat to the north, becoming a forest ranger in a place where humans were nearly non-existent, where life and death sorted themselves out naturally. No one came to her cabin in the winter, and she didn't need anyone. All she wanted was silence. And in that silence, she believed she had learned how to live without any connection at all. Until one morning, when a strange sound pierced through the thick snow, breaking everything she once believed. Charlotte Kidman walked slowly through the heavy snow in the quiet Yukon forest. Pale winter light filtered through the bare trees, casting long shadows on the pristine white ground. Her thick gloves were damp and cold, but she didn't mind. She only meant to be outside briefly, gathering a few dry branches to add to her small cabin supply. A rare day off during the harsh winter, one she had planned to spend reading by the stove, but her legs had pulled her outside, as if part of her still needed to move, to be reminded she was alive. But then she stopped. A sound, low, shaky, hoarse, rose from deep within something's throat. It wasn't the wind, nor the creak of frozen trees. Charlotte paused and tilted her head. The sound came again, hesitant, broken, but clearly the cry of a creature in pain. Her instincts as a ranger kicked in immediately. Her seasoned eyes scanned the frozen woods for the slightest movement. Slowly, she moved toward the sound, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her survival knife. And then she saw it. A bear. A large female grizzly lying on her side in the snow, trembling all over. Her right hind leg was caught tightly in an old steel trap, a type that had long been banned, though they still sometimes showed up in the forest, left behind by unscrupulous poachers. The trap had bitten deep into her flesh, and the blood had soaked the snow into a dark crimson smear, a heartbreaking sight. Charlotte didn't hesitate. Her heart clenched at the sight of the pain before her, but immediately her caution returned. A wild bear, even injured, is dangerous. If it feels threatened, it could attack. One swipe from its paw could kill. She stepped back slightly, her eyes locked onto the animal, but then her eyes met the bear's, and they weren't full of anger as she had expected, but of sheer, utter exhaustion. The look of a creature that no longer had the strength to fight, left alone in the frozen world. Beneath the frost-coated gray fur was a body slowly fading with every breath. And when Charlotte leaned in closer, she noticed something that made the scene even more heartbreaking. The bear's belly sagged, a clear sign she was a nursing mother. "Oh God," Charlotte murmured, one hand covering her mouth. What did this mean? It meant that not just one life was in danger. Somewhere in this forest, maybe not far, were bear cubs too young to fend for themselves, waiting for their mother to return. If this bear died here, from blood loss, from cold, or from Charlotte walking away, those cubs would die too. Why had the bear left her den and ended up here? Had it been destroyed? Was it no longer safe? Charlotte clenched her fist. She had lived her life in nature. She had seen tragic things, had stepped in, and had walked away. But this time was different. Maybe it was the look in the bear's eyes. Or maybe the quiet, desperate sigh that had escaped from the bear's throat. She knelt beside the animal. "I don't know how much of this you understand," she whispered, "but I'm not going to let you die here." The trap wasn't easy to remove. Charlotte's hands, calloused from years in the wild, still trembled as she gripped the steel jaws. The bear flinched slightly, her ears drawing back, as if bracing to defend herself. and Charlotte was forced to pause. "It's okay. Easy now," she whispered, her voice as soft as wind through grass. "I just want to help." With all the strength and care she could muster, Charlotte worked the mechanism. Every time she touched the wounded flesh, the bear's body shuddered and a hoarse, muffled sound escaped its throat, too weak to be a growl, more like a moan. Finally, with a precise twist and a deep breath, the trap snapped open. Charlotte quickly pulled the injured leg free. Blood rushed out, flowing into the snow in thick streams. Her breath caught in her throat. She unwrapped the scarf from her neck and tied it tightly around the wound to slow the bleeding. "You have to live," she murmured, her voice firmer this time. "Not just for yourself, but for your babies too." She stood, her body aching and her thoughts spinning. She had to get back to the cabin. Should she do more? Could the bear survive? And what if she did? What if she healed and later turned on Charlotte? A soft sound of crunching snow behind her made her turn. The bear, still trembling, still bleeding, was following her slowly, painfully, but surely. Each step was heavy, each movement a struggle. Yet she dragged herself forward, head bowed, eyes fixed on Charlotte. There was no aggression in those eyes, no begging either. Just presence, silent and steady. Charlotte stood frozen, heart pounding. "No," she whispered. "You have to go back. I can't let you come with me." But she didn't turn away. She couldn't. It was something her heart wouldn't allow. A lifetime among animals had taught her sometimes the lines blur. Between human and wild. Between help and harm. Sometimes a living being, any kind, just needs a hand. Charlotte looked back at the bear. "Can you keep up?" she asked softly. Then she turned and began walking. Step by step, she led the way, and step by painful step, the bear followed. Two creatures, one human, one beast, moving side by side through the frozen woods, saying nothing, yet bound together by something wordless. Survival. Charlotte woke the next morning to thin rays of sunlight filtering through her frosted window. Snow had fallen again during the night, piling in thick layers on the porch and fence outside. She rubbed her eyes, still heavy from deep sleep, and suddenly noticed something strange. The cabin was too quiet. There was no soft shuffling in the corner where Helen usually lay. No deep, raspy breathing. A sinking feeling spread through her chest. She threw off the covers and rushed to the corner of the room. The old blanket she'd laid down was empty. Helen was gone. A sudden heavy stillness settled around Charlotte. Part of her had known this moment would come, that one day the bear would leave. But not like this, not without a sound. No warning, no parting glance, just silence, and a trail of bear tracks leading out into the snow. She stepped outside, gripping the icy railing as she looked toward the forest. The tracks disappeared into the trees. "Take care," she whispered, her lips trembling with cold, and something else, an ache in the chest that was harder to explain. She returned inside, lighting the stove and wrapping her hands around a mug of hot tea. But all day long, she couldn't shake the feeling of something missing. The cabin, once a haven of quiet solitude, now felt truly empty. Helen had changed things. Even in just a short time, her presence had filled the room, through the weight of her breathing, the depth of her gaze, the way she nestled into the corner like a child in need of shelter. And now that absence rang loud through every wall and floorboard. As twilight fell, Charlotte lit a candle on the kitchen table and reached for her journal. But before she could write a word, a sound cut through the quiet. A call, low and guttural, a bear's voice, unmistakable. Long, muffled, and yearning. Charlotte froze, then rushed to the window. Night had cloaked the woods. Only the moonlight glinted off the snow. Then she saw her, Helen, standing outside the cabin. "Oh my God," Charlotte breathed, opening the door a crack. A blast of cold air hit her face, but what she saw made her forget it completely. Helen wasn't alone. In the shadowy snow behind her stood four small figures, bear cubs, fluffy, wobbly-legged, clustered around their mother. They weren't afraid, just quiet, curious, staring at Charlotte with wide, cold black eyes. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected Helen was a mother. She had seen the signs, the sagging belly, the swollen teats, but she had never truly imagined this moment, the bear returning, with her cubs. Helen took a step forward, then stopped. Her head tilted slightly. Her eyes asked a question. Charlotte looked at her, then at the tiny cubs huddled against the wind. Perhaps their den had collapsed or been discovered by predators. She didn't know, but she saw something in Helen's eyes, something she had seen once before. Trust. "You want to stay?" Charlotte whispered, as though asking an old friend. Helen gave a deep, rumbling sound in reply. Charlotte opened the door wider. The wind howled past her, but so did something else, a strange, warm current. Helen entered first, then one by one her cubs toddled in after her. Their little paws thudded against the wooden floor. Charlotte turned to grab more firewood, her back warm by the feeling of eyes following her every move. When she turned around again, the four cubs were curled into a pile beneath the table. Helen sat beside them, her eyes half closed, her body finally at rest. Charlotte lit a pot of water, set out a little food, and poured herself tea. In her chest, emotions swelled, astonishment, gratitude, awe. No one had ever taught her how to live with bears, but something told her. Compassion, no matter the species, would always be answered with a miracle. Winter had not yet loosened its grip on Yukon. Snow still blanketed the ground thickly, and sharp winds sliced through the trees like blades. But Charlotte's cabin was no longer just a retreat for one solitary soul. It had become a den, a sanctuary for an entire bear family. Since that unforgettable morning when Helen returned with her cubs, something inside Charlotte had shifted. Without hesitation, but with utmost care, she reorganized the kitchen, moved furniture, laid out extra blankets, dry straw, and even those old cloth sacks she had kept from her years at the Wildlife Center. The back left corner of the room, close enough to the stove for warmth, but distant enough for space, became their temporary den. Charlotte never touched the cubs, not once, even when they toddled clumsily across the cabin floor, their soft paws making barely a sound on the worn wood, even when they sniffed at the hem of her coat with noses wet and curious, or when they playfully nipped at the frayed leather of her boots like mischievous toddlers testing boundaries. She held her stillness. She never reached out, never indulged the longing to run a hand over their thickening coats or scratch behind their velvety ears. Instead, she let them come and go as they pleased, while she remained a quiet fixture in the room, an observer, never an intruder. Every gesture she made was measured, respectful, deliberate, an offering of space more than presence. Each morning, Charlotte woke before dawn to the muted sounds of breathing, soft huffs and rustles, and moved carefully around the cabin. She prepared a bowl of oatmeal, the steam curling upward in lazy spirals, and added a spoonful of honey from the jar she kept hidden away on the top shelf. She always placed the bowl a short distance from the fire, not too close to intrude, not too far to be unreachable. On milder days, she ventured out, wrapped in layers of wool, to gather dried berries still clinging to stubborn winter bushes, or strips of edible bark she had learned to recognize. These small offerings weren't hand-fed. She never beckoned them closer, never gave them names, never blurred the sacred line between Helen's cubs and her own human heart. They weren't hers. They belonged to the wild. She knew that. Still, each time she set the bowl down and stepped back, her chest ached with something that felt very close to love. The cubs slept often, as all young animals do, tucked against their mother's great body in a twitching, tangled pile of fur. Charlotte sometimes paused her stitching to simply watch them, the way their tiny paws twitched in dreams or their ears flicked at phantom sounds. Helen, though the wound in her leg remained visibly swollen, never faltered in her devotion. She nursed them patiently, groomed them with sweeping strokes of her tongue, kept their small bodies tucked against her side, blanketing them in warmth and calm. Charlotte once witnessed one of the cubs whimper in its sleep, a soft, barely audible cry, and despite her obvious exhaustion, Helen immediately roused herself and nudged the cub closer to her chest, then emitted a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the room like a lullaby no human could ever replicate. A sound ancient and instinctive, a song only bears understand. Charlotte never wrote during those days. Her journal sat closed on the windowsill, collecting a thin layer of dust. But had she picked up her pen, she might have written a single, simple truth. I'm living among the brave souls of the wild, and the most miraculous part is They let me stay. Because deep down, she knew the truth of her role here. This wasn't her home, not really. The cabin had become a sanctuary, yes, but it didn't belong to her alone anymore. It was borrowed space, temporary ground shared between two worlds. Helen and her cubs were not pets. They were not guests to be entertained or domesticated. They were wild things born of snow and instinct, and Charlotte never once forgot that. She didn't play the old records tucked away in her trunk. She kept the overhead lights dim and relied instead on lanterns and firelight. She refrained from sudden movements, loud voices, anything that might blur the edge between her quiet life and their primal rhythms. She avoided eye contact unless Helen offered it. She never tried to teach them, never tried to tame them. She simply lived alongside them, one breath at a time, and slowly that silence between them became a language of its own, a mutual understanding written not in words, but in glances, stillness, and the trust that blooms only when no one demands it. At night, while the wind curled around the cabin like a great animal seeking entry, Charlotte sat in her chair by the hearth, hands steady on the embroidery hoop or wrapped around a mug of hot tea. The fire snapped gently beside her. Behind her, a world breathed in quiet harmony. Helen and her cubs, their bellies rising and falling in rhythm. In those moments, Charlotte understood something rare and profound, that trust doesn't always come from logic. It doesn't arrive with declarations or promises. Sometimes it's born in a single moment, shared between two beings, one who opens a door and one who walks through it, carrying with them winter, memory, and the fragile beginning of something like hope. Time passed, not in grand events, but in the smallest of changes. The rhythm of life slowed to the pace of melting snow, and as winter loosened its grip, the world outside began to shift. The deep white blanket of Yukon began to thin. Gentle rivers returned, carving their paths through ice and memory. Shoots of green emerged in hesitant patches, like shy smiles across the forest floor. The air softened, smelled faintly of thawing earth and birch sap. The forest was stirring. One morning, Charlotte stood quietly at the window, watching as morning light filtered through the trees, catching in the newly glistening icicles and painting gold over everything it touched. It fell on Helen, too, who now lay with her head raised, her fur no longer matted but sleek, her breath slow and steady. Her limp had faded almost entirely. Her body was strong again, whole again. And the cubs, once fragile and clumsy, were now curious, alert, and lean with muscle. They sniffed at the door. They pawed at the wood. Their ears perked at sounds far beyond the clearing. Something was calling them. Charlotte felt it like a tug in her own chest. The wilderness, untamed and ancient, was summoning them home. And Charlotte, standing in her quiet little cabin with one hand pressed against the glass, knew exactly what that meant. It was almost time. 2 months had passed. The cabin, once a refuge for one woman and 4 wild souls, had become something much more, a sanctuary, a resting point in the story of life. Every day, Charlotte had quietly recorded in her heart the little details. The sniffing snout buried in the oatmeal sack, Helen's protective growl when a loud crack split the night, the silent gaze shared between woman and bear by the fire. She never forgot that she was human and Helen was wild, but somewhere between them, something deeply human and deeply bear had been woven. A thread of trust, of mutual presence, of quiet companionship. And now spring had come. Charlotte stood at the door one morning and opened it wide. The wind had lost its edge. It smelled of thawed earth and pine. Helen stood nearby, her eyes gazing out into the woods. The cubs ran to her, nuzzling, restless. No words were spoken, no commands were given. But the moment had arrived, a moment where silence was the clearest kind of goodbye. "Go on," Charlotte whispered, though she didn't expect anyone to understand. Helen turned her head one last time. Her gaze met Charlotte's, not cautious, not unsure, simply steady, certain. Charlotte stepped back, giving them space. She said nothing more. Helen moved forward, leading her young into the forest. The 4 cubs tumbled behind her, their chubby paws leaving soft prints in the damp grass, a ribbon of life stretching from winter into spring. At the forest's edge, Helen stopped. She looked back one last time, not with fear, not with gratitude, but with understanding. And then she disappeared into the trees. Charlotte remained standing at the doorway for a long while, her fingers resting lightly on the wooden frame, as if afraid that letting go would somehow undo everything that had happened. The wind, gentler now in the early breath of spring, brushed past her cheeks like a memory refusing to fade. In her chest, something stirred, an ache that wasn't sorrow, not quite. It was quieter than grief, deeper than nostalgia. Her heart felt both empty and full, like something precious had been taken, but not in mourning, more like something sacred had been returned to the earth, to where it had always belonged. A chapter completed, a bond released, but not severed. Eventually, she stepped back into the cabin and closed the door behind her with a soft click that echoed louder than expected. The space now felt larger, quieter, still. But it wasn't a hollow silence. It was the kind that wraps around you gently, like a hand on the shoulder. The kind that carries weight and warmth. There were no more deep breaths in the middle of the night, no low huff of bare lungs stirring the shadows, no watchful eyes glimmering from the corner, no soft scratch of claws on wooden floors just before dawn. Those sounds had filled the cabin for weeks, marking time in their own wild rhythm. Now the emptiness felt strange, like waking from a dream too beautiful to explain. She sat down slowly, her body easing into the old rocking chair with a seat that mirrored her own. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. She poured herself a cup of tea and her hands trembled just a little, not just from the fading chill of morning, but from the gravity of the quiet, from the weight of the memory that had already begun to settle into her bones like the scent of smoke in old wood. In the rising steam of the cup, Charlotte saw Helen again, just as she had been that first day, torn, bleeding, trembling with pain and fear. And then the image shifted to the moment the bear had accepted that first bite of food, hesitant but trusting. The moment she had made that low, unnameable sound, a sound not of hunger or fear, but of something else, something sacred. A murmur of recognition, a call not of desperation but of belonging. As if, in that strange winter-bound miracle, Charlotte had become something more than just a woman with a cabin and a kind heart. She had become part of Helen's story, maybe even part of her family. Now that Helen had returned to the wilderness where she belonged, Charlotte didn't feel regret. She had done what was right, not what was easy or safe or comfortable, but right. She hadn't tamed, hadn't taken. She had offered warmth without ownership, shelter without condition, compassion without conquest. She had given a wild creature the one thing the world often failed to offer a place to simply be. Outside, the snow was melting faster each day. The streams whispered again. The trees had begun to shake off their icy coats. The forest was waking up. And the Yukon, always vast and ancient, sang new melodies now, songs carried in the babble of water over stone and the tentative chirps of birds returning home. Somewhere in that boundless wilderness, Charlotte imagined the soft footfalls of a bear mother and her 4 cubs weaving through underbrush, curious and alive. She pictured them finding a new den, learning to forage, wrestling beneath shafts of golden spring sun. Maybe, on some quiet afternoon, Charlotte would glance up from her sewing or her tea and see a familiar silhouette standing once more at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting, remembering. Or maybe not. And that would be all right, because Charlotte knew now, in a way she hadn't before, that some bonds don't depend on presence. Some connections, built not from words, but from shared breath and silent trust, become part of the land itself, woven into the falling snow, the footprints in frost, the hush between trees, invisible, but permanent. She took another sip of tea, now lukewarm and faintly sweet, and when the fire crackled behind her, it no longer sounded like the noise of an empty cabin. It sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like home. Female veteran catches a large bear dragging a heavy bag. She's shocked by what's inside. Lena Harper stood at the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains, looking out over the vast expanse of snow and trees. The wind howled through the pines, sending clouds of snow swirling around her like a storm of memories. Her hands, wrapped tightly around the worn leather straps of her backpack, trembled not from the cold, but from the weight of her grief. It had been only a few months since Ethan, her young son, had been taken from her in a car accident. his life extinguished in an instant. She had never known a pain like it. The emptiness that had settled inside her was so profound that it felt as if her very soul had been torn away. The city of Missoula had become unbearable, filled with echoes of laughter that no longer existed, with empty rooms that felt colder than the winter itself. Her house had become a mausoleum, a place where the air was thick with silence. So she had packed her things, left everything behind, and driven into the mountains. She couldn't bear to stay in the place where everything reminded her of what she had lost. The mountains were supposed to offer solace, a way to escape from the painful memories that clung to her every thought. But instead, the vast emptiness only amplified the loneliness that had become her constant companion. It was as if the mountains, like the rest of the world, had abandoned her. She had tried to ignore the whispers in her mind, tried to push away the memories of Ethan's bright smile, his laughter ringing through the house, his tiny hands reaching for her as she tucked him in at night. But no matter how hard she tried, they always came rushing back, drowning her in sorrow. The cabin she had rented was small and old, nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest neighbor. It was a refuge, a place where she could isolate herself, where no one would ask questions or try to comfort her with empty words. She didn't need comfort. What she needed was time to forget, time to heal. But no matter how much time passed, the pain remained, gnawing at her insides like a hungry animal. Each morning she woke to the same emptiness, the same aching void where her son used to be. She had tried to fill the silence by chopping wood, by cleaning the cabin, by staring out the window at the endless white expanse of snow. But nothing worked. Nothing eased the ache that had taken root in her chest. On that particular morning, Lena had ventured outside, the cold air biting at her skin as she walked to the edge of the snow-covered clearing in front of the cabin. Her boots crunched through the fresh snow as she moved with slow, deliberate steps, the bitter wind tugging at her jacket. The world around her seemed frozen, as if the earth itself had stopped moving, suspended in time. She stopped, staring at the distant line of trees, wondering if the world outside her isolation had continued to spin while she remained stuck in her grief. But then, as if the silence had been shattered by the weight of her thoughts, something moved in the distance. At first, it was just a dark shape against the white snow, but as Lena's eyes adjusted, she could make out the figure of a large bear, a sow, dragging something behind her. It was an odd sight. Bears didn't usually wander this close to human habitation, especially not in the middle of winter. Lena frowned, her curiosity piqued despite herself. She had spent enough time in the wilds of the Bitterroots to know that animals often traveled through the snow in search of food or shelter. But what was this bear carrying? It wasn't until the bear drew closer that Lena could see clearly. The large, mud-streaked canvas bag, battered and torn, seemed out of place. It wasn't something a bear would typically carry, certainly not something that would interest a predator. The sow paused at a distance, seemingly aware of Lena's presence. But she didn't seem afraid. She stood there, her breath coming in heavy puffs, as if waiting for something. Lena's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps it was a piece of discarded garbage, maybe some kind of prey the bear had scavenged. But then, to her shock, the bear dropped the bag at her feet, and for the first time in weeks, Lena felt a sudden rush of warmth in her chest. Inside the bag was a tiny, shivering creature, a bear cub. Its small body was bruised and weak, barely moving, its fur matted and caked with dirt. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she dropped to her knees beside it, the world around her suddenly spinning with confusion and disbelief. Why would the bear bring the cub to her? Why leave it at her doorstep? For a long moment, the sow stood at a distance, watching Lena intently, her gaze calm but filled with a strange desperation. She didn't move closer, didn't seem to be demanding anything. It was as if she was entrusting Lena with this fragile life, leaving the cub behind without a word, without a sound. Slowly, Lena reached out, her hands trembling as she touched the small body of the cub. It was cold, so cold, but still alive, its shallow breaths a fragile promise of life. The sow didn't make a sound, but her eyes locked with Lena's for what felt like an eternity. Then, without another glance, she turned and disappeared into the forest, vanishing into the mist, leaving Lena alone with the cub. Lena sat there for a moment, her heart racing, her thoughts a blur of confusion and disbelief. What had just happened? What was she supposed to do with this cub? She had no experience with animals, let alone wild ones. The sow had trusted her, but Lena didn't know if she could live up to that trust. She couldn't even care for herself. She had lost her son. What kind of mother was she? She gently picked up the cub, cradling it against her chest, the warmth of its small body a stark contrast to the freezing air. Inside the cabin, she laid the cub on a soft blanket, studying its tiny form as it shivered. Its body was bruised, its fur matted with dirt and ice. Despite her own grief, Lena felt an instinctive pull to care for this creature, to protect it from the cold that threatened to consume it. She didn't know why, but she knew she couldn't leave it out there to die. She couldn't let this innocent life slip away as Ethan had. And so, with no knowledge of how to care for a bear cub, she began to do what she could. She wrapped the cub in towels, warmed it with the heat from the stove, and watched over it as it slept, its tiny body trembling with each shallow breath. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Each day that passed, the cub grew stronger, and Lena began to feel a small flicker of hope. It wasn't the same kind of hope she had once known, before Ethan's death. But it was something. She named the cub Ash. It was a name that felt right, as though it were a symbol of something that had burned out but not completely died. Something that could still be revived, still be given another chance. Ash wasn't her son. He could never be. But as she sat by his side watching over him, she realized that in caring for him, she might just find the strength to start over, to learn how to live again. As the days passed, Lena's world began to shift. At first, the silence of the cabin had pressed against her like a suffocating weight, each moment stretching into eternity, filled only with the unrelenting pain of grief. But now, with Ash by her side, the silence began to change. It became more of a space, an empty room in which something new could grow. She hadn't expected the cub to survive. His fragile, shivering body had seemed so small, so helpless. But each day he clung to life with the strength of something that refused to be extinguished. The first time Ash had opened his eyes, weak and unfocused, she felt a small flicker of hope in her chest. It was so faint, so fleeting, that she almost thought she had imagined it. But then, as the days went on and Ash started to show signs of recovery, that flicker grew. Each time she wrapped him in towels to keep him warm, fed him the small meals of porridge she made from scraps, and sang softly to him, something inside of her began to heal. Lena would sit by the fire, the light flickering softly in the cold, and watch Ash sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling. She'd often find herself thinking of Ethan, of the small boy who had once curled up beside her in just such a way. And then, as if in answer, Ash would stir, nuzzle against her, and she'd feel the thread of a connection between them, something neither of them had known they needed. The first few nights were the hardest. Ash would wake every few hours, restless and whimpering. His tiny bear cub cries tugged at her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was a sound that reminded her of how small and fragile life could be, the echo of her own pain mixed with his, loss, survival, the desperate search for warmth. Lena would sit beside his seat, her hand on his tiny back, reassuring him with soft words, even though she had no idea if he understood. The act of caring for him had become an anchor for her. With each day, as Ash grew stronger, so did she. The cabin, once cold and silent, began to feel warmer. It was still a place of solitude, but now there was a sense of purpose in her movements. Every morning she would wake up early and check on Ash. His tiny dark eyes would blink up at her, filled with trust. He would nuzzle against her hand, his small claws reaching for the warmth of her touch. She had become his mother, in every way that mattered. She was learning how to nurture again. Each day, Ash grew more aware of his surroundings. He began to explore the cabin, stumbling over his own feet, trying to climb onto the furniture, his small paws scraping against the wood floor. Lena would laugh softly, her heart swelling with tenderness. It had been so long since she had laughed. It felt strange, almost foreign, but in Ash's presence, it felt natural. Her laughter was a reminder that life could still be full of unexpected moments of joy, even after the darkest of losses. Slowly, as the days turned into weeks, Ash started to grow. His little body began to fill out, the sharpness of his ribs softening as he grew stronger. His movements became more sure, more purposeful. Lena started to teach him simple things, how to forage for berries in the small patch of woods behind the cabin, how to climb the tree in the yard. Each lesson felt like a tiny victory, a small step forward for both of them. She was teaching him how to survive in the wild, but in doing so, he was teaching her how to live again. One afternoon, while Lena was gathering wood from the forest, she felt the presence of something behind her. She stopped, her hand frozen on the handle of her axe. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and a chill ran through her. She turned slowly, her heart thumping in her chest. At first, she thought it was just the wind, or perhaps a trick of the light, but then she saw it, the bear sow. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees, watching Lena with those calm, intelligent eyes. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sow didn't move. She just stood there, her dark fur blending with the shadows of the trees, her gaze fixed on Lena, almost as if she were waiting for something. The world around them seemed to stop, the only sound the wind rustling through the pines. Lena's heart beat louder in her ears. The sow didn't seem angry or aggressive. There was no growl, no sign of threat. It was as if she were simply watching, waiting. Lena slowly stepped back, not wanting to provoke the sow, but not wanting to show fear either. She had learned enough about bears during her time in the wild to know that they were creatures of instinct and patience. The sow continued to watch her, her gaze steady and calm. It was almost as if she were assessing her. And then, as if satisfied with whatever it was she had seen, the sow turned and disappeared into the forest. Lena stood there, her breath coming in short bursts, her mind racing. That had been the moment of truth, the moment when she realized the sow had been watching over Ash, even after leaving him behind. The sow had entrusted him to her care, but she was not giving up. She was simply waiting, observing, making sure Ash was safe before returning. Lena didn't know how she knew that, but she felt it deep in her bones. The sow had come back to check on him, and now Lena understood that Ash was not just hers to keep. He was part of a larger world, a world she had only begun to understand. When Lena returned to the cabin, she found Ash waiting for her, his small body now sturdier, his eyes bright with curiosity. He had grown so much in such a short time. He followed her everywhere now, his tiny paws padding softly across the cabin floor. Lena's heart ached with love for him, for the little bear who had found his way into her heart when she thought she could never love again. And then it hit her. This was how life worked. The sow had trusted her with Ash's care, and now, in return, she had to learn to trust again, to let go of the past and embrace the present, no matter how painful it might be. Ash wasn't her son, he never could be. But in taking care of him, she had found something she had lost in the depths of her grief: purpose. She had learned that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there could still be moments of tenderness, moments of calling, also joy. In moments of connection, though, the days turned into weeks, and Lena's life slowly began to shift. Ash had become more than just a bear cub she cared for. He had become a part of her world, a new light in the darkness. The pain of losing Ethan had not disappeared, but it had softened, had found a place beside the love she felt for Ash. She knew the day would come when she would have to let him go, when he would need to return to the wild, to the world he truly belonged to. But for now, he was her bridge between the past and the future, a reminder that even in the hardest of times, there was still hope. There was still love. And when the time came, Lena would do what the sow had done. She would love fiercely, and she would let go. As spring began to creep into the Bitterroot Mountains, the snow that had blanketed the world for so long started to recede. Lena could feel the change in the air, the crispness of winter loosening its grip on the landscape, the thaw of the earth beneath her feet. The days grew longer, the sunlight warmer, and with each passing week, she could feel herself beginning to emerge from the cocoon of grief that had wrapped her so tightly for months. She still missed Ethan, still felt that hollow ache deep within her chest, but caring for Ash had become a way to navigate through the silence. The cabin, once a place of suffocating stillness, was now a home, no longer defined by absence but by life. The rhythms of their daily existence had found a quiet, unspoken balance. Ash had grown stronger. His sleek black fur was beginning to gleam in the sunlight, his eyes filled with curiosity as he explored the world around him. It was almost impossible to believe how far he had come since that first fragile, shivering day he had appeared at her door. He was still small, still far from ready to survive in the wild, but his spirit had ignited. Lena often found herself watching him with a mixture of awe and tenderness as he played in the yard, rolling in the fresh grass, sniffing at the trees, and occasionally climbing the low branches of a pine. There was something innocent about the way he experienced the world, a rawness that felt familiar, like the way a child would discover the world for the first time, his excitement untainted by fear or doubt. It was hard not to smile at his antics. She often found herself laughing quietly, the sound foreign at first but becoming more natural as the weeks passed. The laughter felt good, like a slow, steady stream of life trickling back into the places she thought had frozen over forever. But there was a quiet undertone to those moments, an awareness that Ash was growing fast and that the day would come when he would no longer need her. Lena had always known that she couldn't keep him forever. Ash wasn't her son. He wasn't a replacement for Ethan, no matter how much she wished he could be. He was a bear, wild and free, and though she had become his caretaker, she understood that one day he would have to return to the world from which he came. It was a truth she had accepted in the quiet of the cabin, the acceptance slowly blossoming in her chest as the days turned into months. One morning, as Lena was brewing coffee in the kitchen, Ash wandered to the window, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. She looked up from the pail, following his eyes, and saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the wilderness stretching out before them, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the soft rustle of leaves and grass in the wind. But Ash seemed focused, his ears pricked, his body tense with alertness. His stance was different today, as if he was sensing something she couldn't see. She had learned to trust his instincts. In the time they had spent together, Ash had proven to be far more attuned to the natural world than she had ever expected. He had learned quickly how to forage, how to recognize the signs of a storm, how to navigate the terrain around their cabin. It was as if he could sense the changes in the air before they happened, his wild instincts guiding him in ways that Lena could only begin to understand. She set the coffee pot down, walking to the window to see what Ash was so focused on. As she peered into the distance, she spotted it, massive paw prints in the fresh snow, circling the cabin in an almost deliberate pattern. They were unmistakable, the prints of a bear, the same size and shape as the sow who had left Ash in her care months ago. A shiver ran down her spine, a mixture of fear and awe. The sow had returned. Lena's heart beat faster. She hadn't expected it, hadn't thought about the possibility of the bear returning after all this time. But there it was, the unmistakable sign that the sow had been watching from the shadows, silently checking on her cub. The air around her felt charged, the space between the cabin and the surrounding woods suddenly filled with a palpable energy. Lena stood still for a long moment, watching the prints in the snow. She could feel Ash beside her, his gaze still locked on the tracks, his body taut with a quiet tension. He seemed to know. He seemed to understand that this was a moment of significance. Slowly, she turned to look at him. His eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, Lena saw something in him that took her breath away. A quiet understanding, a deep recognition of what had come before. He wasn't hers to keep, not in the way she had imagined when she first took him in. She had never been his mother, not truly. The sow had trusted her to care for Ash, but that trust was only temporary. Ash was part of a larger world, one that Lena could never fully enter. He had his place in that world. The realization was both heartbreaking and beautiful, a reminder of the fragile, fleeting nature of the connections between humans and animals. For all the love she had poured into him, for all the ways she had come to see Ash as her own, she knew the time had come for him to return. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to let go of him. Not yet, but the world had other plans, and sometimes that was all there was to it. Slowly, Lena reached down and touched Ash's fur, her hand resting gently on his back. She didn't need to say anything. He knew. With one last lingering look, she turned and walked out the door, her boots crunching on the snow as she followed the tracks. Ash followed her closely, staying at her side, the two of them moving silently through the forest. As they neared the edge of the clearing, Lena saw the sow again, standing in the distance, her eyes fixed on Ash. She was a large, imposing figure, her fur dark against the whiteness of the snow. She wasn't close, still a few yards away, watching them from the edge of the trees. But it was clear now, she had come back for her cub. Ash hesitated for a moment, his body tense. He looked back at Lena, his gaze filled with something she couldn't quite place. It was as if he was saying goodbye, but also thanking her for everything she had given him. Then with a soft grunt, he took a step forward, his paws making the first move toward the sow. Lena stood still, her heart aching, as Ash took one last look at her, his eyes reflecting the connection they had shared. And then, with a swift, graceful movement, Ash disappeared into the trees, following the sow into the wild. Lena watched him go, her heart heavy with sorrow and love. She had given him the best she could, but she knew, as painful as it was, that it was time for him to be free. The wild was where he belonged. And though her heart ached with the emptiness of his absence, she knew that, like the sow, she had loved fiercely, and now she would let him go. The wind whispered through the trees, the sound of the wilderness carrying on the breeze, as Lena turned and walked back to the cabin. The world felt different now, quieter, emptier, but also full of possibility. She wasn't the same woman who had stumbled into these mountains months ago, lost in grief. She had been transformed by Ash, by the wild, by the love she had given him and received in return. And though she had to let him go, she knew that in doing so, she had found something she had long since lost, a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. The days after Ash's departure were filled with silence once again. The cabin, once alive with the gentle rustle of the bear cub's paws on the floor, now seemed quieter, emptier, as though the echoes of his presence were still lingering in the corners. Lena didn't know how long it had been since he left. A week? 2? Time had lost its meaning. It felt like both an eternity and just a heartbeat since she had last seen his wide, curious eyes, since he had last pressed his warm, small body against hers as they sat by the fire. But now there was only the silence of the mountains, broken only by the soft wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. She had stayed away from the edge of the clearing where the sow had appeared that last time, not wanting to face the truth of Ash's departure. The sow had taken him, and he was gone. But it was harder than Lena had expected. It wasn't that she hadn't known it was coming. It had always been a matter of when, not if. She had known from the start that Ash was never meant to stay with her. He was a wild thing, and no matter how much she had loved him, he belonged to the forest. But the ache of his absence was sharper than anything she had anticipated. For so long, she had been focused on him, on caring for him, on keeping him safe from the elements, from the cold that could be so unforgiving in these mountains. In the process, she had allowed herself to feel again, to experience something close to joy, to laughter. And now, with his absence, that joy seemed to have gone with him. The healing she had felt in the days they had spent together seemed like a distant memory, as fragile and fleeting as the warmth of a fire that had long since burned out. But as Lena sat by the fire one evening, her thoughts wandering back to the time when Ash had first arrived at her door, she realized something. The grief was still there, yes, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp, all-consuming pain that had nearly drowned her when Ethan died. It had softened. She could still feel the ache, still carry the weight of the loss, but it no longer crushed her. Caring for Ash, loving him as fiercely as she had given her something she thought she had lost forever: the ability to heal. She had opened her heart again, and in doing so, she had found the strength to move forward, to face the future without the constant cloud of despair hanging over her. The mountains had not only taken Ash back into the wild, they had taken her grief and molded it into something she could live with. She wasn't whole, but she was not broken either. There was room now in her heart for both the sorrow of loss and the quiet joy of survival. Lena spent her days walking the trails near the cabin, breathing in the fresh mountain air, feeling the ground beneath her feet, grounded in a way she hadn't felt in years. She would pass by the trees where Ash had climbed, where she had first shown him how to forage for food, where he had learned to be wild, and every time she would stop, her hand resting on the rough bark, and she would think of him. He was out there somewhere in the forest, in the wilderness he had been born to. He was where he belonged, and in her heart, she knew that was the most important thing. It was on one of these walks, weeks after Ash had gone, that Lena found herself back at the clearing, the place where he had last disappeared. She had avoided it for so long, not wanting to face the emptiness that still lingered in her chest, the hollow place he had once filled. But today was different. Today, the air was warmer, the sky a brilliant blue, And for the first time since Ash had left, Lena felt a sense of peace as she stood at the edge of the clearing. She closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face. She felt connected to everything around her, the earth beneath her feet, the trees that swayed gently in the breeze, the birds that flew high above, and most of all, the mountains that stretched endlessly before her. The world was vast, filled with life and possibility, and for the first time in months, Lena didn't feel alone. She felt like part of it all, a small thread in the fabric of the wilderness. She didn't know if Ash would return to this place, if he would ever find his way back to the cabin. But in that moment, Lena understood that it didn't matter. He had been a gift, a thread of life that had found its way to her when she had needed it most. He had helped her heal, helped her remember that there was life beyond the pain, and now it was time for her to let go. She didn't need to keep him. She had already given him what he needed. He had returned to the wild, to the place where he could grow, where he could become who he was meant to be. The world was his now, and Lena had to accept that. And yet, as she stood there, a part of her would always carry him with her. The memory of the little cub who had looked up at her with trust and curiosity, the bond they had shared. She smiled softly, the last of the grief in her heart loosening, dissolving into the vastness of the mountains. She would carry that love with her, always. With a deep breath, Lena turned away from the clearing and began walking back toward the cabin. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the snow, and she could feel the peace of the evening settling over her. She knew that her journey wasn't over. There would be more healing to come, more struggles, more moments of pain, but she was ready for it. She was no longer defined by her loss. She had found her way back to life, and as the mountains whispered around her, Lena knew that she could face whatever came next. She had learned the most important lesson of all, to love fiercely, to live fully, and when the time came, to let go. The forest would always hold the memory of Ash, but it would also hold the memory of her, a woman who had served, who had loved, and who had found healing in the wild. She would carry it with her, always, as she walked forward into the unknown. The mountains stretched endlessly before her, a vast, open horizon of possibility. And for the first time in a long while, Lena felt ready to meet it.